So here's a little tutorial on some thoughts about grid settings and starting in InDesign and all of that. And as you see, I have my InDesign back here. This is your type specimen sheet assignment, which I'm gonna put up for all of you this afternoon. So the publication is 36 pages in black and white, 5 1/4 by 10 1/2 size. Is a 2-column grid based on a 3-point baseline grid using your selected typeface. You can only use type sizes 10, 16, 21, 34, and 68. Notice that these type sizes are based on the Fibonacci sequence, and I have put here a Fibonacci sequence for you. So the top is the point size, the bottom is the baseline, the leading, right? Remember, leading is the space between the bottom of the top line and the bottom of the second line beneath. So it's that space in between that allows you to read. So the more leading you have, the easier it is to read, or the wider it is, possibly. If you make it too wide, then you start losing, the reader starts losing the flow of the text. This is based on a Fibonacci sequence cheat sheet that I have, that a friend of mine actually gave me. So the point size is up here, and the leading is down here. Notice that it continues. The reason this is in two spaces is this continues. The Fibonacci sequence is a mathematical equation, so it just keeps going, right? So that means, for example, that if you have type size 10 points, which is one of the ones you can use, your leading, because you have a three-point baseline grid, it's going to be 3 or 6 or 9 or 12 or 15 or 18, 21. Now, 10 points type size over, which is the way it traditionally is notated, 10-point type size over the baseline. Now, 9 point is probably going to be too tight. 12 will start working possibly, depending on your typeface. You will need to even go to 15 points, right, for the baseline. You never go 10, oh, let me go to 4.5 or 33. It's going to be too tight at 4.5. At 33, it's going to be huge. Again, this leading goes, this leading goes across this way just because I could not put the chart on forever going on. And the same thing here. And if you do the math, you notice that a Fibonacci sequence is a mathematical equation. Again, here's the big chart that my friend did, which is a double-stranded, which means 2 Fibonacci sequences. Here's the Fibonacci series, a medieval scale, Timian scale, which is a Pythagorean scale, which again, these are just all forms that have been created throughout history to sort of work with proportion. Here's the grid scales, increment of 1.5 or 3. We're going to work with the increment of 3, right? So you are able to maintain your typography in a nice, even sense of proportion. So your type will start to feel proportionally well set, even though visually it may not be doing things in the traditional sense. Okay, so that's what that chart is. In the assignment sheet as well, I have put 2 other sheets, and as you see, I'm moving through my screen here. One is on setting a document and setting grids. I want you to be totally aware of the margins in your book. It is up to you what margin you choose, right? Remember that we ran in the tutorial that I gave you guys a few weeks ago, I did sort of like a Fibonacci sequence or margins. If you want to use sort of a Fibonacci for the margins, you can go ahead, which is the top margin is, the proportion is 1 to 1. 1, the top margin, to the left margin is 1. The right margin is 2, and the bottom is 3. So that proportion is 1 to 1, 2 to 3, right? So this little sheet shows you how to set up a 12-column grid. Keep in mind, InDesign always gives you this standard margins. You need to figure that out, okay? The gutter, the same thing. Always is 0.1667. Gutter is the space in between the columns, right? So keep in mind that the gutter is directly related to the baseline. So if you go back to your baseline, and let's say that your type has you have 10-point type, right? And a baseline of, let's say, 12. Usually, to get the gutter, you add 1.5 to that 12. So that would be like 13.5, right? Um, and that adjusts your gutter in the columns, right? Now, that doesn't mean that's always acceptable. You need to look at it and see if it's appropriate, because if your gutter is too tight, columns start to bleed together and it becomes just one big gigantic column. But again, notice that these are all proportions of each other. Therefore, if you start using a typographic scale like this, you start to see the mathematical relations between all the elements on your page, right? So I want you to keep that in mind. And again, if you set your margins, whoops, I don't want that, cancel that, sorry. If you set your margins to all even all around, what does that say? That's sort of a more modernist take on it, right? If you set your margins in the Fibonacci sequences, that say that it's something more traditional. So if you have a more traditional typeface, do you stay with traditional margins, or do you bring it to the now because you're designing it right now, right? So I want you to start thinking about that. Here they show you on this little handout your baseline grid, and your baseline grid runs across, is where the lines of type sit, right? And the interesting thing is, here's the InDesign typesetting palette that I'm also including on your assignment sheet, which is if you open your paragraph palette, you will see that this little hamburger mark shows you the lines are not on the baseline grid. If you click on this one, it will put them on the baseline grid. Also, if you're using style sheets, you can tell the style to sit the lines on the baseline. So you're forcing the lines on the baseline. Otherwise, your lines of text don't line up. And that's something really, 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 really important. What you also have here is you also have in InDesign, for example, character palette. And remember, InDesign, like Photoshop, works in many different ways, where the palettes are on top, and then you can pop them out as well, because Adobe duplicates palettes. You could start talking about kerning. Normally, traditionally, InDesign has to set up as metrics. Metrics kerning is the actual kerning pair numbers that the designer of the typeface set up. By that I mean the space between pairs of letters. So for example, a designer will design the T and the Y, and will set up the kerning pair for when the T and the Y appears, and the Y and the P, and the P and the E, etc. You can select this and select optical, which is a setting that Adobe set up so that the typeface becomes more, the typeface, what it will look like optically, right? So a lot of typesetting is about looking at it and seeing how it looks, how the spaces in between the letters, how the spaces in between the lines, whether they're comfortable for a reader to engage in, right? So that's the other thing. Here's your setting for the baseline when you're doing it manually. But if you do a style sheet, then you can automatically set it and you don't have to worry about it. The other thing that you find here is the story palette, which is in the type. You can open Windows, type is story. It will do the optical margin alignment on the left-hand side, which means all the type on the left-hand side, including punctuation, will hang, giving that line a nice even flow all the way down. And I'm going to do a little tutorial so you'll see. Also, your hyphenation palette, you can pop it open. And the thing that you want to keep in mind is that your hyphen limits should be about 2. You should never have 3 hyphens at the end of a line in 3 consecutive lines. You cannot do that. That's sort of not acceptable. It breaks the flow for the reader to see all these little lines at the end, if you choose to do hyphenation. If you don't do hyphenation, you have to work on your rags and your graphs a lot more, because then you have issues with spacing. You can also pull out your justification palette, which is super, 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 super helpful. And the best thing that I can tell you here is the word spacing, which is automatically set up by design 80, 100, and 133. If you change this to 70, 80, and 90, that's a really good percentage, which you'll start to see what happens to your graph of text, which starts to even it out more. and gives it a more cleaner flow of the text. So you'll start to see. Again, all these are settings to get started. This is not that this is going to be the setting. Also, you should not rely on the standard settings that InDesign does. You should go ahead and set your own settings. Because as a designer working with type, that is what you're doing. You're sort of really working with the typography, really working with the typeface to get that text to read or to engage with the reader in a particular way. Okay, so I'm going to do another video where I'm going to show you settings in InDesign, in the actual InDesign, but I just wanted to review this before going ahead. So I'm going to make another video now. Okay, bye.